The first time Irene Quinn noticed the brown paper parcel sitting on the fence post outside the mill, she assumed someone had simply forgotten their lunch and walked on without giving it another thought. It was the summer of 1883, deep in the heart of Cowboy County, New Mexico Territory, where the sun hammered the earth like a blacksmith working a stubborn piece of iron, and the wind carried red dust into everything. Your eyes, your teeth, the creases of your knuckles. The town of Salder's Creek was not a large place, barely more than a scatter of timber and adobe buildings huddled together along a single main road as if seeking warmth from one another, though warmth was never in short supply in that part of the territory. There was a general store run by the Hoffman family, a small church with a crooked steeple, a livery stable, a saloon that never seemed to sleep, and the copper mill where Irene had been working since the spring, hauling ore records, keeping ledgers, and doing every task the foreman assigned her with the kind of quiet, stubborn efficiency that came from having no other choice. Irene was 24 years old. With dark brown hair she kept pinned severely at the back of her neck because loose hair caught in the machinery, and she had seen what that meant. Her eyes were the color of creek water in the shade, a gray-green that shifted depending on the light and depending on her mood, and the women in town who noticed such things privately agreed that Irene Quinn was far too pretty to be spending her days in a copper mill covered in dust. Irene herself had no patience for such observations. Pretty did not pay rent. Pretty did not feed her younger brother Thomas, who was 17, and living with her in the two-room shack they rented at the edge of town while he finished his schooling. Pretty was a currency she had never learned how to spend, and she was not interested in learning. She had come to Salder's Creek 7 months earlier from Silver City, after their father had died of a fever that took him in less than a week, and left them with nothing but a few dollars, a mule that subsequently ran off, and a letter of introduction to the mill foreman, a heavy-set man named Curtis Pratt who had known their father years ago. Pratt had given her the job out of something that was half charity and half genuine need. He was short-handed, the mill was expanding, and Irene could add a column of numbers faster than anyone he had ever employed. She had been grateful without being particularly warm about it, because gratitude without caution was something she could not afford either. The second time she found the parcel on the fence post, she picked it up. It was 3 days after the first one, and this time she noticed it before any of the other workers arrived, in that thin blue light just before sunrise when the desert was almost cool, and the world smelled of sage and iron-tinged earth. The parcel was wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of rough twine, and when she opened it she found 2 thick slices of bread with butter, a wedge of hard cheese, a strip of dried beef, and 2 dried apricots. It was a good lunch. Better than good, it was more food than she had eaten at any single sitting in the past 2 weeks. She stood there in the early light with the parcel open in her hands, looking around the empty yard, and felt something prickle at the back of her mind. But the yard was empty, and the morning was already beginning to heat, and she was hungry in a way she had trained herself not to think about too directly, so she rewrapped the parcel, set it behind the ledger box she kept at her station, and told herself she would investigate the matter later. She did not investigate the matter later. She ate the lunch at midday and felt steadier and more herself for the rest of the afternoon than she had in weeks, and the question of where it had come from drifted to the back of her mind, the way things do when you are tired and stretched thin and surviving mostly on determination. The third time it happened, she paid closer attention. She arrived at the mill just as the sky was beginning to lighten to pink along the eastern ridges, and she did not go directly to the main building. Instead, she stood in the shadow of the water barrel near the gate and watched, and after about 10 minutes she saw him. He came on horseback, a tall bay horse with a white blaze that she would later learn was named Copperhead, which she would also later find both amusing and apt. The rider swung down from the saddle in a single easy motion, the kind of motion that belongs to someone who has been on and off horses so many times that the action has become as unconscious as breathing. He was lean and broad-shouldered, wearing a battered brown hat with a slight curl to the brim, dark trousers, a worn cotton shirt the color of a winter sky, and a pair of boots that had seen considerable country. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same red rock that surrounded this whole territory, dark stubble across it, and brown eyes that she would not be close enough to see the color of for another week. He tied the horse at the post along the fence line, reached into his saddlebag, and withdrew a brown paper parcel. He set it on the fence post with a care that struck her even from a distance, not carelessly, not hurriedly, but with a kind of deliberate gentleness. Then he looked at the post for just a moment, adjusted the parcel so it would not fall, and walked away along the road toward the far side of the mill yard where the day laborers gathered. Irene stepped out of the shadow of the water barrel and stared after him. She had seen him before, she realized. He was one of the cowboys hired to haul ore from the outlying dig sites to the mill. There were a dozen of them, rough-and-tumble men who came and went on contract, and she had logged their names in the work ledger, but had not until this moment attached names to faces with any particular diligence. She watched him disappear around the corner of the mill building, and then she looked at the parcel on the fence post, and then she looked back at where he had gone, and something in her chest did a thing she was not accustomed to it doing. His name, she discovered when she opened the work ledger that morning, was Edwin Maddox. He had been hired 6 weeks prior on a hauling contract that ran through the end of September. His handwriting in the employment register was surprisingly neat, careful, deliberate letters that stood at attention, and under next of kin he had written only a name, Clara Maddox, Roswell. She did not know if that was a wife or a sister or a mother, and she told herself it made no difference. It made some difference. She watched him from a distance for the next several days, which she justified to herself as simply being a natural function of curiosity, the kind anyone would feel in similar circumstances. He worked hard, that much was immediately evident. He arrived before most of the other hands and left after, and he handled the heavy ore carts with a steadiness that suggested a man comfortable with long, difficult labor. The other men seemed to like him well enough. She saw him laugh at something a younger worker named Pete said one afternoon, and the laugh transformed his face entirely, cracking open all that carved rock seriousness into something warm and unguarded, and Irene looked back down at her ledger very quickly and pretended she had not been watching. The parcel appeared on the fence post every morning. By the end of the second week, she had settled into accepting it without the guilt she thought she ought to feel, because the truth was that she and Thomas were struggling in a way she had not fully admitted to herself. The rent on the shack was $3 a month, which was not a great sum by some measures, but was a considerable portion of what the mill paid her. Thomas's school cost another $1.50, and the rest went to food and lamp oil, and the occasional necessary repair a broken window latch, a worn-through boot sole that could not wait another payday. She had been stretching their food carefully, eating less herself so Thomas could have enough, and the lunches that Edwin Maddox left for her, without knowing that she was the one taking them, or so she assumed, were making a genuine difference to how clearly she could think in the afternoons. She told herself she would find a way to pay him back or to pay it forward. She told herself she would speak to him about it. She told herself many things. What she actually did was watch him when she thought he was not looking, and notice things. She noticed that he was 30 years old, give or take, with the particular quality of stillness that some men develop in the desert, a learned economy of movement that conserved energy and revealed nothing unnecessarily. She noticed that he was kind to the horses in a way that was not showy or performative. It was simply how he was with them, patient and quiet and consistent. She noticed that he ate whatever the mill provided for the day laborers at midday, without appearing to derive any particular pleasure from it, which at the time she attributed to stoicism, and would later understand differently. She noticed that he never once looked toward the fence post where he left the parcels, not with any visible expectation or even any visible interest. He simply left them and went about his day as if the matter were entirely concluded. It was the fourth Tuesday of the month when she first spoke to him. She had not planned it. She had been carrying a stack of ore-weight records from the main building to the foreman's office when the wind, which could be spectacular and sudden in this part of the territory, came ripping across the yard and took the top third of her papers directly out of her hands. They scattered across the yard in a white flurry, and she made an undignified noise of distress and chased after them, catching some against the wheel of a cart, snatching others from the air, and then standing helplessly as 3 or 4 tumbled toward the road. She heard boots on packed earth, and then he was there, moving quickly along the road's edge, stepping on one paper to stop it, scooping up 2 more, and turning to catch the last one just before it hit a mud puddle near the horse trough. He brought them to her, holding the rescued papers out, and she saw his eyes clearly for the first time. They were brown, yes, but not a flat brown. There were layers to them, amber near the center, darker toward the edge, and they looked at her with a directness that was not challenging, just honest. "Thank you," she said, because it was the appropriate thing to say and because she could not think of anything else. "Wind gets ideas of its own out here," he said. His voice was low and steady, not a drawling voice but a careful one, as if he considered words before deploying them. "It does," she agreed. There was a pause in which she was very aware that she was still looking at him, so she looked down at the papers and organized them and then looked up again. "You are Edwin Maddox," she said. It came out more directly than she intended. Something shifted very slightly in his expression, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. "I am," he said. "I am Irene Quinn. I keep the ledgers." "I know," he said. And then when her eyes narrowed just slightly at that, he added, "You signed my work contract. In the register, your name is on it." "Right," she said. "Of course." He nodded once, looked at her for another moment, that same direct, unhurried look, and then touched the brim of his hat in a small, old-fashioned gesture that she found both archaic and oddly touching, and went back to his work. She stood in the yard for a moment longer than she needed to, the reorganized papers in her hands, feeling the sun on the back of her neck and something else entirely in the center of her chest. That evening she told Thomas about him. Thomas was a lanky, good-natured boy with their mother's red undertones in his dark hair and a habit of asking more questions than most people had patience for. He was doing his reading at the table by the lamp when she came in, and he listened to her account of the day's encounter with the attentiveness he reserved for things he found genuinely interesting. "And you think he is the one leaving the lunches?" Thomas said, when she had finished. "I saw him do it, but you have not asked him about it." "No," Thomas considered this. "Why not?" Irene set a pot on the small cast-iron stove and did not answer for a moment. "Because I am not sure what I would say." "You could say thank you," Thomas offered. "You are generally good at that. Thank you implies I am accepting them." "You are accepting them." "Thomas." "I am just saying," he said, "that there is a man who is giving you his lunch every day and you have not said a word to him about it." "I am aware of what the situation is," she said, somewhat tartly. "He must be a good man," Thomas said, turning a page of his book with the philosophical placidity of someone who has no intention of dropping a subject. "Most men do not give away their food." Irene stirred the pot and did not say anything, which Thomas, who knew his sister well, correctly interpreted as agreement. The next morning she arrived earlier than usual. She had made a decision in the night, lying on her narrow cot listening to the desert wind around the corners of the shack, a decision that had felt clear and sensible in the dark, and now, in the pearl-gray pre-dawn with the mill yard still empty, felt considerably more complicated to execute. She had brought a parcel of her own, which had cost her more than she could really spare, 2 good corn cakes, a portion of salt pork she had been saving, and a small square of the hard candy Thomas loved that she had bought as a thank-you token and now repurposed with some guilt. She set her parcel on the fence post next to the spot where Edwin Maddox always left his. Then she stepped back and waited. He came as he always did, on the big bay horse, moving through the early light with that particular ease, and she watched him see her from 20 feet away and check for just a fraction of a second before continuing forward. He swung down from the saddle, tied the horse, and came toward the fence post with his own parcel in hand. He stopped when he saw hers. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "That is not for you to pick up," she said. "That one is yours." He looked at the parcel again, then back at her. "I see," he said, in a tone that suggested he was doing a great deal of careful processing behind those amber-brown eyes. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, "for the lunches. I have been taking them, and I should have said something sooner, and I am sorry that I did not. It was not polite of me." There was a silence, not an uncomfortable one exactly, but a weighty one. "I did not leave them expecting thanks," he said finally. "I know," she said. "That is actually one of the reasons I wanted to give them." He looked at the parcel on the fence post and then very carefully set his own parcel down beside hers. He untied the twine of his own and then hers and looked at the contents of both, and then he looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "Miss Quinn," he said, "I have a question, and I would like you to answer it honestly." "I try to answer everything honestly," she said. "Are you managing all right, at the mill, in general?" The question caught her off guard because it was not what she expected him to ask, and because it was the precise question she had been refusing to ask herself for the better part of 2 months. She felt something rise up in her throat, not tears. She would not cry in the mill yard in front of a man she barely knew, but something in the territory of tears, and she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin and said, "Well enough." He looked at her for a long moment with those careful eyes. "That is not a yes," he said gently. "No," she admitted, "it is not." Another silence. This one felt like something being decided. "Then keep the lunches," he said. "Both of them if you want. I am fine." She wanted to argue. She could see that arguing was the sensible and dignified thing to do. Instead, for reasons that still confuse her when she thinks back on it, she said, "What is in yours?" He looked down at his parcel. "Bread, some salt beef, cornbread." "Mine has corn cakes and salt pork," she said. "We could," she stopped. "Share," he finished. "That would be fair," she said. He picked up both parcels and held them for a moment, and then he smiled. It was the first time she had seen it directed at her, that smile, and it did more than she was prepared for. It changed everything about his face, softened the carved stone seriousness of it, and made him look younger and somehow more real, as if the smile were the true face and everything else was the careful container around it. "All right, Miss Quinn," he said. "Fair enough." They did not share lunch that day. The demands of work kept them on opposite ends of the mill yard, but they shared it the day after, sitting on the flat side of a large sandstone boulder at the edge of the property, where there was just enough shade from the overhang of the mill roof to make the midday heat bearable. The conversation was careful at first, the way conversations between strangers are careful, each person measuring what they say and watching for the other's reaction. He told her he was from Texas originally, from a small town east of El Paso, and that he had been working cattle and hauling contracts across the territory for the past 8 years. She told him she was from Silver City, that she had a younger brother, that she was saving money to, she paused here, uncertain how much to say, to eventually do something more settled. "What kind of settled?" he asked. He had a way of asking questions that suggested he genuinely wanted to know the answers, not as a social formality but out of actual interest. "I had thought about a school," she said. "I was nearly trained as a teacher before," she stopped again, "before things changed." "What kind of things?" She looked at him. He was sitting with his back against the warm sandstone, hat tilted to shade his eyes, a piece of cornbread in one hand, watching her with that patient attention. "My father died in the spring," she said. "He left debts." "I am sorry," he said, and the simplicity of it, no platitudes, no rush to move on, made her feel oddly steadied rather than uncomfortably pitied. "He was a good man," she said. He was just not very practical. Most good men aren't, Edwin said, and something in his voice suggested he was not being cynical, just observant. They ate the rest of the lunch in a silence that had become, without her quite noticing, comfortable. The wind was quieter today, moving through the sage at the edge of the property with a soft, dry sound, and somewhere on the road a wagon was passing, and someone was whistling a hymn slightly off-key. Irene sat with her ankles crossed and her back straight as it always was, and she was aware of Edwin Maddox sitting 3 feet away, and of the warmth of the sandstone through her dress, and of a peculiar feeling of rightness that she had not felt in a very long time, which alarmed her considerably. She was not in a position to feel things like that. She had Thomas to consider, and rent to pay, and a position at the mill that depended on her being reliable and professional and unentangled. She reminded herself of this very firmly as she stood and brushed cornbread crumbs from her skirt. "Thank you for the bread," she said. "It was good." "Thank you for the corn cakes," he said. He had stood too, and she noticed that he was taller than she had registered before. She came to about his shoulder, which was a height differential that she managed not to think about for approximately 4 seconds before thinking about it. "Tomorrow, then," she said, meaning the lunch. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She walked back toward the mill building without looking back, which cost her more effort than she would ever admit. The lunches continued. Every morning, Edwin Maddox arrived at the mill and tied his horse at the fence post and left a parcel. And Irene Quinn arrived and left her parcel beside his. And at midday, they divided everything between them at the sandstone boulder. It became routine with a swiftness that surprised her, the way certain things, when they fit properly, slide into place so naturally that it becomes hard to imagine they were ever absent. Thomas noticed that she was eating better and asked no questions, which she appreciated, though she caught the thoughtful look on his face once when she mentioned Edwin's name in passing while describing some mill business, and she did not elaborate. During those noon hours, she learned things about him in the slow, layered way you learn about people when you pay attention across time, rather than trying to extract everything at once. She learned that the name in the employment register under next of kin Clara Maddox was his younger sister, not a wife, and that he sent her money every month from his contract wages. His parents had died when he was 19, his mother first, then his father within the year, and he had raised Clara through her teen years on cattle wages and seasonal work, and she was now married to a good man in Roswell and expecting her first child. He was proud of her. It came through clearly in the way he spoke about it, a warm, gruff pride that he did not embellish, but that was entirely evident. "You raised her," Irene said one afternoon. The sky above the ridge was doing something spectacular with orange and rose, the way New Mexico skies sometimes did in the late afternoon, as if compensating for the harshness of everything below. "I tried to," he said. "She is a better person than I am, so I cannot take too much credit." "I doubt that," she said. He glanced at her. "Doubt which part?" "That she is a better person than you." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something move across his face, not the full smile, but something in the direction of it, a slight softening at the corners of his eyes. "You do not know me well enough to say that," he said. "I know enough," she said, and heard, as soon as the words were out, how much weight they carried, and looked away. There was a silence, not the comfortable kind this time, but the kind that follows when something true has been said and both people are deciding how to hold it. He spoke first. "I know enough too," he said quietly, and left it at that. She went home that evening with her heart doing something unreasonable. It was in the 3rd week of July when things between them shifted into new territory, and it happened because of Thomas. Thomas had been working evenings at the livery stable to bring in a few extra dollars, sweeping, feeding, the unglamorous labor of mucking stalls that he performed without complaint, because he was a genuinely good-natured young man with a practical streak that Irene sometimes thought he must have been born with, since it had certainly not come from their father. On a Tuesday evening, he was crossing the road between the livery and the general store when one of the cowboys from the Harker Ranch, a surly man named Bell who had a long-standing quarrel with the livery owner, shoved him off the boardwalk into the road. Thomas, being 17 and not in possession of fully developed judgment regarding which battles to accept and which to walk away from, said something pointed back at Bell. Bell hit him. Not badly. Thomas was not seriously hurt, just a split lip and a bruised cheek and a healthy dose of wounded dignity. But he was shaken and he was bleeding when he came through the door of the shack that evening, and Irene, who had been sitting at the table trying to reconcile a row of figures that would not balance, stood up so fast she knocked the chair back. She got him cleaned up and assessed the damage. Nothing broken, he was fine. She kept her face steady and her voice calm throughout, and then she sat back down at the table and her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat to the table and breathed carefully, and Thomas watched her with that perceptive young face. "Irene," he said. "I am all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I am all right too. Bell is the town drunk and I should not have said what I said." "You should not have been pushed," she said. "That is also true." She looked at her hands on the table. "I am going to ask Mr. Pratt to let me take on the Saturday ledger work," she said, "for extra pay. Then I can give you money to take the stage to Roswell in August, to stay with the Hannigan family until the school term starts." Thomas had a distant cousin by marriage in Roswell, a kind woman named Martha Hannigan, who had once offered to have Thomas if Irene ever needed the arrangement. It was a good school in Roswell, better than the one here, and Martha's offer had stood. Thomas looked at her for a long time. "I do not want to leave you," he said. "I know," she said, "but you should go. It is a better school and you should have that. What about you?" "I will be fine," she said. "I am always fine." "That," Thomas said, with the devastating accuracy of someone who knows you very well, "is exactly what worries me." The next morning at the fence post she was quieter than usual, and Edwin noticed. He said nothing immediately, because that was how he was. He watched and he waited and he did not push. But over the noon lunch, with the sun directly overhead and the shade scarce and the heat a solid thing pressing down on everything, he set down the piece of dried beef he had been eating and looked at her. "What happened?" he said. She told him about Thomas, about Bell, about the stage to Roswell and Martha Hannigan and the better school. She told him more than she had intended to, because Edwin Maddox had a quality she had not encountered frequently: a genuine stillness in his listening, an absence of the restless interruption and unsolicited advice that men often deployed when women spoke, that made her feel, perhaps unwisely, that she could say the real thing instead of the acceptable version of it. "He is a good boy," she said, "and I want him to have more than I can give him here, and I know that sending him to Roswell is right, and I am—" She stopped. "Afraid to be alone," he said, not a question. She looked at him sharply, the reflex of someone who does not like to be seen clearly, and then the reflex passed and she looked at him steadily instead. "Yes," she said. He looked back at her steadily. In the weeks since they had begun sharing lunches, she had learned to read some of his silences, the way a slight tightening around his eyes meant he was working something through, the way a certain quality of stillness meant he was about to say something he had thought about carefully. "You would not be alone," he said. "Not exactly." She felt the words settle. She did not ask what he meant. She thought she might know, and the knowing was something she needed to carry carefully for a while before she did anything about it. "Thank you," she said, for the second time in as many weeks, in the particular tone that meant something larger than the immediate context. He nodded and picked up the dried beef again, and they finished their lunch as the heat peaked and the sage shimmered in the distance, and a hawk crossed the white sky above the ridge without any apparent effort at all. It was 2 days later that she finally understood about the lunches. She had, by this point, stopped thinking about it. The mechanics of the morning arrangement had been explained. They were splitting food. It all made a kind of practical sense, and she had allowed herself the comfortable fiction that this was simply a mutual arrangement between two people who happened to have adjacent fence posts and adjacent lunch hours. But on a Thursday morning in late July, she arrived at the mill before dawn for a reason she would later barely remember, some paperwork that needed to be filed before the weekly ore delivery. And she passed by the kitchen building, where the mill provided basic food for the day workers, the ones who did not bring their own. She was not paying close attention. She was tired and the sky was still dark at the edges, and she was thinking about the column of figures in the delivery ledger. And she heard from inside the kitchen building the voice of one of the Mexican workers, a friendly older man named Refugio, speaking in conversation. She heard him say, clear as a struck bell through the thin board wall, "The cowboy again. He does not eat midday, does he? I have never seen him take his portion." And another voice, younger, that she recognized as Pete, the young worker Edwin sometimes laughed with. "He says he is not hungry, but I never seen a man work that hard and not be hungry." And then Refugio, "He gives it away, I think. That big parcel he brings in the mornings, he gives it to the ledger woman." She stopped walking. She stood very still on the packed earth outside the kitchen building with the ledger under her arm and the sky going purple above the ridge and the mill silent around her, and she understood. He gave her his lunch, his entire lunch. Both portions, the one he brought from wherever he was staying and the one the mill provided to day workers at midday. He had told her he was fine. She had believed him because she had wanted to believe him, because it was easier than the alternative, because the alternative meant something she was not ready to sit with. But he had been going without, every day, for weeks. He had been going without food through the middle of a working day that required the kind of physical labor that burned through a man's reserves, because he was giving her everything he had. She stood there for a long time. Then she went inside and filed the ledger papers, and her hands were perfectly steady, and her face gave nothing away. And nobody at the mill that morning would have been able to guess what was happening inside her chest, which was something tectonic, something that rearranged things at a level below thought, below the careful structures she had built to keep herself safe and sensible and unencumbered. She did not mention it at lunch. She watched him eat the food they had split between them, his share and hers. And she watched how he ate it without any sign of the restraint she now understood he had been practicing for a month, eating steadily and without the particular urgency of a hungry man, because she had been feeding him along with herself for the past week and a half. He had been hungry, she thought, for weeks before that, while leaving her food every day. He had worked those heavy ore carts on an empty stomach through the worst of the summer heat, and had come to the noon lunches and split what they had, never letting on, never saying a word. She thought about the question he had asked her that first morning. "Are you managing all right?" She had said well enough. He had known it was not a yes, and he had done something about it in the only way he had available to him, quietly, without any expectation of thanks or recognition. When they had finished eating, she looked at him and said, very carefully, "Edwin, can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said, in the tone of someone who has some idea of what is coming. "How long were you going without the midday portion?" she asked, from the mill kitchen. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the ridge the way he sometimes did when he was thinking, as if the landscape helped him organize himself. "A while," he said. "How long is a while?" He looked at her. "Since I started leaving the parcels." "Which was the beginning of June," she said. "Yes, Edwin," she heard the weight in her own voice and let it be there. "That is a month." "About that, yes. You were working the ore carts without eating in the middle of the day." "I have done longer," he said. "I was fine." "You told me you were fine," she said, and she heard the catch in her own voice and pressed her lips together for a moment until she had control of it. "That morning at the fence post. You said you were fine." "I was," he said, and then, after a pause, "eventually." She looked at him for a long time. The hawk was back on its invisible current above the ridge, or perhaps a different hawk, and the wind had picked up to push at the sage in slow, regular pulses. She was aware of everything: the heat, the smell of dust and copper and warm stone, the sound of the mill working somewhere beyond them, and Edwin Maddox sitting 3 feet away with his careful eyes watching her carefully. "Why?" she asked. The word was very simple and it held everything. He did not look away from her. "Because you needed it more than I did." She felt that land. She let it land fully, without deflecting it or qualifying it or building a structure around it to make it safer. "You did not know me," she said. "I knew enough," he said, and she recognized the echo of her own words from the week before and understood that it was deliberate, and that this man, this quiet, stubborn, generous man, had probably been very careful with those words for a very specific reason. "Edwin," she said again, because she could not seem to stop saying his name, and because it felt important each time. "Irene," he said, and that was the first time he had used her name, her actual name, and not Miss Quinn, and she felt it as if he had touched her, though he was still 3 feet away and had not moved. The silence that followed was one of those silences that is not empty at all but full of everything that has not been said yet, all of it present and patient, waiting. "I do not know what to do with you," she said, meaning it in every possible sense. "You do not have to do anything with me," he said. "You never had to. I know that," she said, "but I want to." And that was, without either of them making any grand announcement about it, the beginning of something that neither of them would have been able to name precisely yet, but that both of them knew was real. She started bringing him more food. Not quietly, not on the fence post directly, at noon, at the sandstone boulder, and she started bringing things she had made the evening before. Cornbread thick with the small amount of lard she could afford, beans cooked with chili peppers that Thomas had been growing in a small pot at the side of the shack. On one occasion, a small apple pie that had cost her an afternoon and more butter than she typically budgeted, and that Edwin ate with an expression that was so honestly pleased that she almost laughed. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at the pie and then at her. "I am beginning to think wanting to is a significant motivator for you." "Only for the right things," she said. He considered this with great apparent seriousness. "Am I a right thing?" he asked. She was aware that this was the closest either of them had come to naming what was happening between them directly, and she felt the question settle in her with the same seriousness with which it had been asked. "I think you might be," she said carefully. "I am still working it out." "Take your time," he said, and ate more of the pie, and she sat in the shade of the sandstone boulder and thought that she might not actually need very much more time at all. August arrived with a ferocity that was almost personal. The heat in Salder's Creek during high summer was a thing of genuine severity, the kind of heat that silenced everything at midday, that turned the road into a mirror, that put old men and animals alike in whatever shade was available and kept them there. The mill slowed its noon operations by half in the worst weeks, which meant that the shared lunches sometimes stretched into longer conversations that felt decadent to Irene, who was not accustomed to leisure. She learned that Edwin had, at various points in the past 8 years, driven cattle across 3 territories, worked a silver claim for a season in Arizona, briefly considered taking a homestead before concluding that farming alone did not suit him, and had a near-encyclopedic knowledge of horse management that he had acquired from a Comanche man named Saul who had taught him, years ago, when they had worked the same cattle drive and developed an unlikely friendship. He spoke of Saul with a directness about the man's knowledge and dignity that some men in the territory would not have bothered with, and Irene noticed this and thought about it. She told him in return about her mother, who had died when she was 14, and about her father's optimism, which had been real and genuine and frequently disastrous. She told him about training to be a teacher in Silver City and the particular satisfaction of watching someone understand something they had not understood before, the moment comprehension arrived in a student's face. She told him she missed it. "You would be good at it," he said. "You do not know that," she said. "You explain things very clearly," he said. "The way you explained the ore-weight discrepancy to Pratt last week, you were listening to that," she said. "The yard is not very large," he said without quite apologizing. "You were patient with him. You did not talk down to him even though you had clearly spotted the error and he had not. That is a teaching quality." She looked at him. "You pay attention," she said. "To some things," he said, and looked at her in a way that made her understand exactly which things. The first time he touched her was an accident and entirely her fault. She had been climbing up onto the flat sandstone boulder. It required a small step up, and misjudged the footing on a loose piece of gravel and lurched sideways, and his hand was at her elbow before she had fully processed the stumble, steady and warm, and she caught herself and stood straight, and he was very close. "I have you," he said quietly. "Thank you," she said also quietly, and neither of them moved for a moment that lasted longer than the practical requirements of the situation demanded. "You can let go," she said. "I am all right." "I know you are," he said. But he held her elbow a moment longer before he released her, with the same deliberate, careful quality with which he did everything. And when he let go, she was aware of the precise spot on her arm where his hand had been. She sat on the boulder and arranged her skirt and said nothing else about it, and he sat beside her and said nothing else about it either. But the quality of the silence was different now, warmer, more charged, as if the air between them had changed composition. Thomas left for Roswell on a Saturday morning in the middle of August, on the westbound stage that came through Salder's Creek twice a week. He hugged her for a long time on the boardwalk outside the stage office, long enough that she had to blink several times and look up at the flat white sky to keep herself collected. "Right every week," she said. "Every week," he promised. "You too." "I will." He climbed up into the stage. The driver clucked to the horses. And then he was gone, and Irene stood on the boardwalk in the August heat until the stage had gone entirely from sight, and then she stood a little longer. She was aware of footsteps on the boardwalk behind her, and then Edwin was beside her, not having appeared from any particular direction as far as she could tell. He was not working that day. It was Saturday. "You knew he was leaving today," she said. "He mentioned it when I saw him at the livery on Thursday," Edwin said. "I thought you might like company." She looked at the empty road where the stage had gone. "I would," she admitted. They walked through the town together. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was just a walk, two people moving along the main road in the morning sunlight. And he took her to the small place at the end of the road where the woman who ran the boarding house kept a kitchen and sold coffee to people willing to sit at her two outside tables. And they sat and drank coffee that was too hot and too strong for the weather, and Irene talked about Thomas for a while and felt better for talking about it. And Edwin listened with his full attention in the way he always did, and she noticed that the woman at the other table was watching them with the particular assessing look that small towns have for pairs of people who appear to be something. She thought, perhaps we are something. "Can I ask you a personal question?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "Have you ever—" She stopped and considered how to phrase it. "Have you ever wanted to stay somewhere rather than moving from contract to contract?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, though it was far too hot for that to be practical. "I have thought about it," he said. "What stopped you?" "Mostly it was not the right somewhere," he said. He was looking at the cup, not at her. "Or not the right time, both sometimes." "And now," she said. He looked up at her. "Now there is more to keep me interested," he said. He said it simply, without any particular performance of it, which made it hit considerably harder than if he had been dramatic about it. She looked at him across the small table, this man who had given her his food for a month without telling her, who listened as if what she said actually mattered, who had appeared at her elbow on the morning her brother left without being asked, and she thought, "I am in love with him." Not as a surprise, exactly. More as an acknowledgement of something she had known for a while and been carefully not looking at directly. "Edwin," she said. "Irene," he said, in exactly the same tone she had used, which made her breath catch slightly. "I want to say something, and I want you to take me seriously when I say it," she said. "I take everything you say seriously," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I want to say something about." He waited. She took a breath. "I am glad you left those lunches," she said. "Not just because I was hungry, though I was, but because it was the kind of thing that showed me." She stopped, tried again. "You did not have to. You could have kept your food. Nobody would have blamed you. But you saw someone who needed something, and you did something about it. And you did not make a show of it or expect anything back. That is," she stopped once more because the words were not quite big enough. "It is who you are," she said finally, "and I wanted you to know that I see it, that I see you, and that she looked at him directly the way she had decided to commit to doing because she had spent too much of the past year looking down and away. I care for you, considerably, and it is frightening to say that, and I am saying it anyway." The silence that followed was not long, but it was very full. "Irene," he said, and his voice had changed. The careful steadiness of it was still there, but there was something under it now, something warm and unguarded, the equivalent of that smile but in his voice. "I have been working up to saying something of the same nature for about 3 weeks. You have just beaten me to it. I tend to be efficient," she said, and she heard the slight unsteadiness in her own voice and was not ashamed of it. "I know," he said. He reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, the way he had at the fence post with the parcel, deliberate, careful, certain. "I care for you too, more than considerably." She turned her hand under his so that their fingers interlaced, and they sat like that for a while in the August heat, drinking their too-hot coffee, while the morning went on around them, and a mockingbird did something elaborate in the mesquite tree at the edge of the road, and the town of Salder's Creek continued its Saturday business around 2 people who had come, through the particular mercy of circumstance and a fence post and a brown paper parcel, to find each other. The weeks that followed were the best of Irene's memory, and she would say so freely when she was old, sitting on a porch she could not yet imagine, looking back at this stretch of time as the period when everything tilted in the direction of good. They were not weeks without difficulty. Difficulty was the nature of life in the territory in 1883, and neither of them was naive about that. But they were weeks in which difficulty had company, and that changed everything. Edwin had taken a secondary contract with the mill through September, which meant he was staying in Salder's Creek instead of moving on to the next job as he had done for 8 years. She knew he had done it on purpose, and she did not make him say so, because she was learning the grammar of how Edwin Maddox communicated the things that mattered most to him, not in announcements but in choices, in actions, in the things he did rather than the things he said. He took her riding on a Sunday afternoon in late August, on Copperhead and a borrowed chestnut mare from the livery that the owner, a sunburned man named Gus, lent him with a knowing look. They rode out of town along the creek bed, which was mostly dry at this time of year, but still had its banks lined with cottonwoods that provided real shade. And the quiet out there was a different quality of quiet from the town, deeper and older. The silence of a landscape that had been working out its own concerns for centuries, and was entirely unconcerned with the brief passage of humans through it. She had not been on a horse in months. The demands of the mill and the budget did not allow for it, and she had forgotten how much she loved it, the feeling of movement and wind, of being lifted out of the ordinary small dimensions of daily survival into something that had physical breadth and scope. He rode beside her and pointed out things she would not have noticed on her own, a particular rock formation on the western ridge that he said looked like a sleeping bear from the right angle, which it absolutely did. A hawk's nest in the fork of a dead cottonwood, tracks in the soft sand near what remained of the creek water that he identified as coyote without any hesitation. "You know this country," she said. "I know how to read it," he said. "It takes time, and you have to pay attention." "You are good at paying attention," she said. "Only to things worth attending to," he said, and looked at her sideways in a way that made her face warm, which she attributed to the August sun. They stopped at a wide, flat sandstone shelf overhanging the dry creek and sat with their feet hanging over the edge and the horses grazing on whatever the sparse grass was offering below. The sky to the west had gone into its evening routine, vast horizontal sweeps of rose and copper, and a deep specific blue that she had only ever seen in New Mexico, a blue that seemed to have depth to it, as if you could reach into it and not find the bottom. "Tell me about the teaching," he said. "What you would teach if you could." She thought about it. Below them the creek bed was striped with the shadows of the cottonwoods, and the smell of sage and warm stone was all around them, and she let herself, for once, Think about what she actually wanted without immediately cataloging the obstacles. Reading, she said, primarily, because everything else opens up from there. Mathematics too. And history, real history, not just dates. The stories of how things happened and why. The children in this territory grow up knowing about guns and cattle and weather, and they should know about those things, but they should also know about the larger world and how it came to be and their place in it. Their place in it, he repeated. Yes, she looked at him. Everyone deserves to know they have a place in the larger story, not just the people who already have the resources to claim one. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, something struck through with admiration, open in a way he generally was not. You should do it, he said. The school. Eventually, she said. Why not sooner? Because I need to save enough to. How much do you have? He asked. She looked at him. The directness of the question would have startled her from most people, but from Edwin it was simply practical. He asked the real question when there was a real question to ask. $42, she said. He was quiet for a moment. How much does a school take to start, do you think, in this town? There is the matter of a space and materials. She stopped. Edwin. I am just asking a practical question, he said, and the slight curve at the corner of his mouth told her that he knew perfectly well what kind of question it was. You are doing the thing, she said. What thing? The thing where you see a problem and you start thinking about how to solve it. Is that a problem? He asked. She looked at him for a long moment. The sunset was doing extraordinary things above the ridge, and she was aware of it the way she was always aware of beautiful things, fully at the edge, not wanting to look away. No, she said. It is not a problem. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face that the wind had lifted, with the same care he used for everything. The parcels on the fence post, the horses, the things that mattered. His hand lingered for just a moment at the side of her face, warm and steady, and she turned her face slightly into it, the smallest possible motion, before he withdrew his hand. They sat until the sunset finished its business and the first stars came out, which in New Mexico came out with a definitiveness that was almost aggressive, no gradual appearance, just a sudden scatter of cold fire across the dark. The Milky Way a broad smear of light that made the town below look very small and the universe look very large. We should head back, she said, without moving to do so. We should, he agreed, also without moving. They sat for another few minutes in the large dark and the starlight, and then they rode back to town side by side, the horses comfortable and unhurried on the familiar road. And when he walked her to the door of the shack, she turned and looked up at him in the lamplight from the single window and thought again. I am in love with him. Thank you, she said, for today. Thank you for coming, he said, as if she had done him a favor. He took her hand and pressed it briefly, then released it and stepped back, and she went inside and leaned against the closed door in the dark, and smiled in a way that there was nobody there to see, which was just as well. In September, the contract at the mine was drawing toward its close, and Irene watched Edwin work the remaining weeks with a kind of heightened attention, knowing that the end of the contract had always been the moment when men like him moved on. She had not said anything about it directly. He had not said anything about it directly. They continued their lunches, their conversations, their Sunday rides when the week allowed. And she told herself that whatever happened she would be grateful for this time, and she would not make demands or create expectations. And she was doing a reasonable job of convincing herself of this until the Thursday afternoon when Curtis Pratt called her into his office. Pratt was a large man with a red face and an occasional decency beneath the roughness of him. He sat behind his desk and looked at her across it and said, I am going to offer Maddox a permanent position. She kept her face neutral. Oh, yard foreman. We are expanding into the East Ridge claims, and I need someone who can manage the hauling operation properly. He is the best I have ever had on the carts, and he can read, which is more than I can say for half of them. He paused. I thought you should know, since you two have become. He stopped with the delicacy of a large man navigating a small social space. Friends. We are, she said. Good, he said, and appeared relieved to have the conversation concluded. "I will speak to him tomorrow." She walked out of the office into the yard where Edwin was working, where he did not look up from the cart he was loading, where the late September light was golden and long-shadowed, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had given up pretending was anything other than love open up into something even larger, because he might stay, because he might choose this place, because wanting to might be sufficient reason after all. Edwin accepted the position. He told her on a Friday afternoon at the sandstone boulder, in a matter-of-fact tone that she recognized as the way he delivered things he was very certain of. "Pratt offered me the yard foreman job," he said. "I said yes." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "He told me." A pause. "Are you all right with it?" "Are you asking me if I am all right with you staying?" she said. "Yes," he said. "That is what I am asking." She felt the simplicity of it, the directness of it, the Edwin Maddox-ness of it, just the real question, no decoration. She looked at him in the September light, at the face she had been learning for months, at the man who had given her his food and his attention, and his steady, patient presence without once making her feel that she owed him anything for it. "Yes," she said, "I am very all right with it." The smile arrived in full this time, unhidden, and she smiled back, and it was a moment she would remember in the precise detail that certain moments retain forever: the light, the stone, the sage, and Edwin Maddox smiling at her with his whole face. October came, and with it a moderating of the heat into something golden and bearable, and the town of Salder's Creek settled into its fall routines, the school term beginning, the harvest preparations. The cattle drives pushing south before the cold of the high plateau made the roads difficult. The mill hired on more workers with the expansion, and Edwin's new role kept him busy in a different way, managing schedules, overseeing the hauling teams, doing the organizational work that suited the particular quality of his mind. He was good at it. Irene watched him manage a disagreement between two of the workers one afternoon from her position at the scale house window, and she saw the way he navigated it. No raised voice, no posturing, just clear and reasonable and utterly firm, and both men walked away appearing to have been treated fairly. She thought about what he had said about Saul teaching him to work with horses, patience and consistency, and the knowledge that force only works once while trust works forever. He had applied that to people too, she realized, without making a philosophy of it. He had just done it. She wrote to Thomas about him, at length. Thomas wrote back in his 17-year-old handwriting that looped large across the page. "He sounds like someone worth keeping, Irene. I think you should tell him so properly." And then in a postscript, "Also, I got top marks in mathematics and Martha Hannigan makes excellent peach preserves. I think I am well. I hope you are too." She folded the letter and kept it in the box under her cot where she kept important things. She was sitting at the table one October evening, at the end of her second reading of Thomas's letter, when she made a decision. She made it without a great deal of internal debate, which was unusual for her, because she generally debated decisions at considerable length. But this one felt clear in the way that some things feel clear, not because they are simple, but because they are right. The next morning she arrived at the fence post before Edwin, which she had stopped doing months ago, and she left a parcel. Inside it she had put a small piece of paper, folded twice. She stood in the shadow of the water barrel while he arrived, while he swung off Copperhead, while he looked at the parcel on the fence post with a small expression of puzzlement, since they had long since abandoned the fence post system and gone to handing things directly to each other. He opened the parcel. He found the paper. She watched him read it from across the yard. She had written, "I have been thinking about what you said about the somewhere being right. I believe this is the right somewhere." "I believe you are, Edwin. I should like to stop working around that fact if you are willing." "Irene." He read it twice. She could tell he read it twice because his eyes moved across it, and then his eyes moved across it again, and then he stood very still for a moment with the paper in his hands. Then he looked across the yard at her, at the shadow of the water barrel, which was not nearly enough shadow to hide a person from someone who was paying attention, and she understood that he had known she was there. He walked toward her. She stepped out of the shadow. He stopped in front of her and held up the piece of paper. "I have been willing," he said, "since approximately the 3rd week of June." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that takes you by surprise, and it changed her face the way his smile changed his, and she saw him look at her laughing with an expression that was full of everything. "I am sorry it took me so long," she said when she had recovered. "I told you to take your time," he said. "I meant it." "I know you did," she said, "but I am done taking time. She stopped and then said it. "I want to build something here. I want to teach eventually, and I want Thomas to come back when he is done in Roswell, and she looked at him. "I want this to be a place that is mine, ours. If you are—" "Yes," he said, no qualification, no hesitation. "Yes, Irene." He took her hand and held it. Not the brief pressure at the fence post or the accidental steadying touch at the boulder, but properly, his fingers around hers, and they stood in the mill yard in the October morning with the sun coming over the ridge and the day beginning around them, and looked at each other like two people who have found the thing they were looking for and are allowing themselves to know it. He kissed her for the first time that Sunday, on the flat sandstone shelf above the dry creek, which had become their place in the way that certain places become yours without any formal declaration. The horses were below them, and the sky above them was doing its vast October blue, and she had turned to say something, and he had been very close, and he asked with his eyes. He was always asking with his eyes before anything else, and she answered with hers. And then it was the most natural thing in the world, the way things are that have been moving toward each other for a long time. He kissed her gently and carefully, with exactly the quality he brought to everything, and she put her hand against the side of his jaw and felt the warmth of him and thought, "Here." They parted and looked at each other, and she began to smile, and he began to smile, and there they were, sitting on their sandstone shelf above their dry creek with the October world large and golden around them, completely and entirely in love. He proposed to her in November, on a cold, clear morning with frost on the ground, and the smell of pinon smoke coming from the houses on the road. People had started their fires against the highland chill that came to Salder's Creek when the season turned. He did it without any ceremony about it, because Edwin Maddox expressed the most important things in the most direct terms. He told her that he wanted to marry her, that he had thought about it carefully and he was certain, and that he would be honored to be the person she built her life with, if she would have him. She told him yes. She told him yes and meant it down to the bedrock. They were married in December, at the small church with the crooked steeple, in a ceremony that was brief and warm and attended by a portion of the town that surprised her, because she had not been aware of how many people had, over the 7 months she had been in Salder's Creek, come to regard her with genuine affection. The Hoffman family came, and Refugio from the mill, and Pete and Gus from the livery, and a collection of others, and Curtis Pratt sat in the front row with his large red face arranged into something that, in better light, appeared to be getting sentimental. Thomas came back from Roswell for the wedding. He shook Edwin's hand for a long time, looking at him steadily with the family's gray-green eyes, and Edwin looked back steadily, and some kind of compact was made between them that required no words. Martha Hannigan sent a letter and a small gift of preserves. The winter was cold and quiet and the best of Irene's life thus far. They were living in a better house by then. Edwin's foreman wages allowed for it. A proper house with 2 rooms and a real stove and windows that fit their frames. And they went about the business of being married with the same practical, warm directness that had characterized everything between them. They worked together on the evenings when she brought her ledger work home, and he worked on the hauling schedules, sitting at the table with the lamp between them, occasionally speaking, mostly comfortable in the shared silence that good marriages develop. She started the school in the spring. She had saved enough with Edwin's contribution and with what remained of her mill wages to rent the back room of the Hoffman store on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and Saturday mornings. She had 6 children enrolled at first, ranging in age from 7 to 12, and by the end of the first month she had 9. The day of her first class she was nervous, genuinely, physically nervous, which she had not been in years, and Edwin walked with her to the Hoffman store that Tuesday afternoon and stood at the entrance and looked at her. "You will be extraordinary," he said. "You cannot possibly know that," she said. "I know it," he said. "Go teach them." She went and taught them, and when she came home that evening she sat across from Edwin at the supper table and told him about every child, their names, the look on the face of the youngest when she had read a whole sentence for the first time, the specific and brilliant question the 10-year-old named Marco had asked about numbers, and Edwin listened to all of it with his full attention, the way he always did, eating his supper and watching her face as she talked and letting her have the full breadth of what had been a good day. "Well," he said when she finally stopped. She stopped and tried to find the right word. "It was the most like myself I have felt in years. Maybe ever." He reached across the table and touched her face briefly with one knuckle, a small gesture. "Good," he said. Thomas returned to Salder's Creek in June, having completed his schooling in Roswell. He was 18 now, taller than he had been, with some of the lank of adolescence beginning to resolve into the shape of the man he was becoming. He got work at the livery with Gus, who was getting older and needed reliable help, and he lodged with a family on the far end of town because he was 18 and independent-minded and not about to live with his sister and her husband when he could stand on his own feet. He came to Sunday supper every week without fail. He and Edwin developed the kind of friendship that grows between men who respect each other and share a significant person in common, a friendship built on the practical currency of mutual assistance. Edwin taught him horses, and Thomas taught Edwin, who had significant gaps in his formal education, things from his schooling that he was interested to learn. She would come into the main room sometimes and find them at the table with a map or a book between them, arguing about something with the comfortable energy of people who enjoy arguing. It made her heart feel full in a way she had not expected. The school grew. By the fall of 1884, she had 15 students, and the Hoffman storeroom was too small, and the community pulled together with the particular prairie town pragmatism that she had come to respect deeply. The men contributed labor and materials, and the women contributed organization, and the church lent its fellowship hall on the days it was not in use. And by the spring of 1885 there was a proper school room. A single large space with windows on both sides for light, and a real blackboard that Edwin had arranged to have freighted in from Santa Fe. On the morning the blackboard was installed, she stood in the empty school room and ran her hand along the smooth, dark surface and thought about her father, who had been impractical but good, and about the $10 he had pressed into her hand in Silver City the week before he died, telling her to use it for something that mattered. She had used it for rent and flour and lamp oil and survival, as she had had to, and she had never felt guilty about it, but she felt now, in this room with its proper blackboard and its light-filled windows, that she had finally, in some roundabout way, done what he meant. Edwin appeared in the doorway. He had finished installing the last of the window frames, and there was sawdust on his shirt, and his hat was pushed back on his head in the way it went when he had been working hard. "Is it right?" he said, meaning the blackboard. "It is exactly right," she said. He came and stood beside her and looked at the blackboard. "Do you know what I think about when I look at it?" he said. "What?" "I think that every child who learns to read in this room is going to have more choices than they would have had otherwise," he said. "And I think that is because of you." She looked at him, at this man who had started everything with a brown paper parcel on a fence post, who had gone hungry so she would not, who had stayed because the somewhere was right, who had built things with her and beside her, and never once made her feel that her ambitions were too large or her needs too great. "Because of us," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the light-filled room they had helped build, in the town they had both chosen, and it was enough. It was more than enough. She found out she was expecting their first child in late September of 1885. She told Edwin on a Sunday evening, at the table after supper, with the lamp between them and the cool fall air coming through the window and Thomas's Sunday visit recently concluded. She said it simply. She was going to have a baby, she thought, in the spring, and she was happy about it and hoped he was too. His face did the thing it did, the cracking open, the warmth coming through the careful surface, and he came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took both of her hands and looked at her with those amber-brown eyes that she had learned to read now, thoroughly and completely. "I am very, very happy about it," he said, in the voice he saved for the most important things. She put her hand on his cheek. He turned his face into it, the same small motion she had made on the sandstone shelf above the creek the year before, and they stayed like that for a moment with the lamp making its small warm circle around them, and the dark October night outside and everything they had made together present in the room. She taught through the winter with a steadiness that surprised some people, and surprised her not at all. She had always done what needed doing, and what needed doing was teaching. Edwin watched her with a careful attention that would have been hovering if it had been anyone else, but because it was Edwin it was simply present, simply available, in the way he was always available without being intrusive. Thomas, who was 19 by then and increasingly capable and settled, took on some of the heavier tasks around the house without being asked, and with the matter-of-fact helpfulness that had always been one of his best qualities. The baby was born in April of 1886, on a morning when the desert outside was doing its spring thing, the brief, fierce flowering that the land managed every year before the heat took over again, the brittle bush and the prickly pear in bloom, the air smelling of something green and alive that was very fleeting and very beautiful. It was a boy. They named him James, after no one in particular, but because it sounded solid and kind, which was what they hoped he would be. Edwin held him for the first time in the late afternoon of that first day, standing by the window with the spring light coming through and James a small, indignant bundle in the crook of his arm, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, completely open, no careful surface at all, just wonder and love as plain as anything she had ever looked at. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. "I am your father." She watched from the bed, tired and content and more herself than she had ever been, and thought, "We got here." Thomas came that evening and held his nephew with the careful seriousness of a young man confronting the weight of something entirely new, and then grinned his wide Thomas grin and said, "He looks like a Maddox." "He looks like a potato," Irene said, which was accurate and affectionate. "He is a very good potato," Edwin said gravely, and Thomas laughed and Irene laughed, and even James, who had no opinion yet about anything, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was definitely something, and the room was full of it. The school continued. Irene returned to teaching in the fall, with James in a basket behind the teacher's desk for the first months, which the children adored, and which created certain instructional complications she had not anticipated, but managed with the characteristic efficiency that had always served her well. She hired an assistant by the winter, a young woman named Ruth Vasquez, who was quick and patient and wonderful with the younger children, and the school grew to 22 students by the year's end. Salder's Creek was changing around them. The copper mill expanded twice more, bringing more people to town, and with more people came more of what people bring: commerce and conflict and community. A doctor came, which Irene celebrated. A second saloon came, which she was more measured about. The territorial government began talking about statehood, which was still years away but beginning to feel possible, and the children in her school grew up knowing themselves as people who belonged to a place that was becoming something. She thought about this sometimes, about place and belonging, and the arbitrary mercies of geography and timing. She had come to Salder's Creek with nothing and had found, against all expectation, almost everything she had ever wanted. She knew that this was not the story for most people who came west. She knew that the territory they lived in had been taken from people who had lived here for generations, and that the prosperity the town was beginning to enjoy had been built on a set of arrangements that were deeply unjust in their foundations, and she did not allow herself to look away from that knowledge. She brought it into the schoolroom, the real history, the full story, and she taught the children to think about it, to ask the difficult questions, to understand that the world they had inherited had been shaped by choices, and that they would also make choices, and that those choices would matter. Edwin, when she talked to him about this in the evenings, listened with the full attention he brought to everything, and added his own observations about what he had seen in his years across the territory, about the Comanche man Saul who had taught him the most important things he knew, about the world as it was and the world as it ought to be, and the gap between the two that each person had to decide what to do with. They were, she thought, well matched. Not in the sense of being the same. They were quite different in many ways, but in the sense of fitting together in the places that mattered. In the spring of 1888, Clara Maddox, Edwin's sister, now Clara Ray's, with 2 small children and a husband named Raphael who ran a feed store in Roswell, came to visit. She was 24, dark-haired and direct in the way the Maddox family clearly tended toward, and she embraced Irene at the door of the house with the warmth of someone who had heard a great deal and wanted to see it for herself. "You are exactly as I imagined," Clara said, which could have meant anything. "I hope that is good," Irene said. "It is excellent," Clara said, and went inside to meet James, who was 2 years old and currently attempting to convince the cat to sit in a pot, and Clara's own children, who were 4 and 2, and seemed genuinely pleased to have a cousin to contend with. The visit lasted a week, and Irene found in Clara a friend genuine, uncomplicated, the kind of friendship built on mutual recognition of character, which happens quickly when both people are paying attention. She and Clara sat at the table in the evenings after the children were in bed and talked, while Edwin and Raphael sat on the porch and did whatever men do on porches, and she thought about how a brown paper parcel on a fence post in June of 1883 had led to this particular evening, to this table and this lamplight and this friend. She mentioned it to Clara, obliquely. Clara looked at her with Edwin's directness, which was uncanny in a different face. "He did that with me too," she said. "When we were growing up and things were hard, he would just manage to find food from somewhere, and when I asked he would say he was not hungry. I used to think he had a cast-iron stomach that required less than normal people." She shook her head. "He goes without rather than let someone he cares about go without. It is his way." "I know," Irene said. "When I found out he had been doing it for you, that he had been leaving you his lunch," Clara stopped. "He had not told me. I found out from one of the men who worked the mill when I came to visit him that winter. He would have let me not know." She looked at Irene. "He does not do things for recognition." "No," Irene said, "he does not." "I am glad you know him," Clara said. "I am glad you know him properly." Irene looked across to the porch where Edwin's voice could be heard, low and even, saying something that made Raphael laugh. She looked at the man she had married, through the window and across the evening distance, with the particular clarity of someone who has looked at the same person across enough evenings to have learned all the versions of them and loves every one. "I know him properly," she said. "It took some time." "Good things usually do," Clara said, and they refilled their coffee cups and talked until it was very late. Their second child arrived in the early spring of 1890, a girl this time, who came into the world with a decisive ferocity that already suggested her character. They named her Sarah. James, who was almost 4, received his sister with the solemn magnanimity of a small person who has decided to be generous, and within a week they were inseparable in the way small children sometimes are, following each other through the house and the yard in a unit of mutual investigation. Edwin watched them from the porch one afternoon with an expression that Irene, coming to stand beside him with her coffee, recognized immediately. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I used to think a person needed to have traveled a great deal of ground to have a meaningful life," he said. "That staying in one place felt like contraction, like giving something up. And now," she said, "now I think I had it entirely backward," he said. He was watching James lead Sarah, who could barely walk steadily, across the yard toward the interesting thing they had identified at the fence line. "This is the largest I have ever been." She slipped her hand into his the way she always did. He held it the way he always did. The school by 1891 had 30 students and 2 full-time teachers, Irene and Ruth, and had been formally recognized by the Territorial Education Board, which came with modest funding and considerable paperwork, the latter of which Irene managed with the ledger efficiency that had never left her. On a Thursday afternoon in October of that year, she was sitting at her teacher's desk after the day's classes had ended, the schoolroom quiet and light-filled, going over attendance records, when Edwin appeared at the door. This was not unusual. He sometimes came by at the end of the day if his work at the mill allowed. But there was something in his expression that she had learned over 8 years to read as particular. "What is it?" she said. He came and sat in the chair across from her desk that the parents used when they came to talk about their children, folding himself into the child-scaled chair with the slightly awkward dignity of a tall man in a small space. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me then." "I want to tell you that this," he gestured with one hand, not at the schoolroom specifically, but at something larger. "This is everything I did not know I was looking for." She set down her pen and looked at him. "I know I have said that in different ways," he said, "but I want to say it directly because I think direct is better. You are everything I did not know I was looking for, Irene. This life we made. Our children. Your school, Thomas, Sundays, the way you look in the evening when you are reading, all of it." She let the words settle. She thought about a morning in June of 1883 when she had stood in the shadow of a water barrel and watched a man leave a brown paper parcel on a fence post for a woman he barely knew, and how that small act of unreasonable generosity had unfolded across 8 years into this. A school, a house, 2 children, a life that was fully and specifically hers. "Edwin," she said. "Irene," he said, with the quiet weight he always gave it. "I knew you were going without," she said. She had told him this before, the morning she worked it out, but she wanted to say it again because it was important. "You went without for a month and you never said a word." "You needed it," he said simply. "That is not a sufficient reason for someone to go hungry," she said. "It was sufficient for me," he said. She looked at him across the small teacher's desk in the schoolroom they had built together, in the town they had both chosen, and she felt the full weight of gratitude, not the uncomfortable, indebted kind, but the deep kind, the kind that has nothing to do with owing and everything to do with being known. "I am going to spend a very long time making sure you never go without anything," she said. He smiled, the full smile, unhidden, the one that transformed his face entirely. "Irene," he said, "I have not gone without a single necessary thing since the day I met you properly." She stood from behind the desk, and he stood from the parent's chair, and she crossed the small distance between them and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the middle of the schoolroom with the October light coming through the windows and the smell of chalk and clean wood around them, and it was quiet and warm and whole. Thomas married a woman named Alice Brewer in the spring of 1892, a practical, warm-eyed schoolteacher from Albuquerque who had taken a position in Salder's Creek, and who was, Irene thought, extremely well matched to Thomas in the particular way that people who love a great number of things are matched to people who love them earnestly. The wedding was at the same church with the crooked steeple, and Irene stood beside Thomas at the front and thought about the two of them in that 2-room shack in the winter of 1882, surviving on careful hope, and how far they had both come. Thomas, at 26, had grown into a man she admired, unreservedly decent and curious and hardworking, still with that habit of asking more questions than people expected. But the questions had grown in proportion to his understanding of the world. He and Alice moved into the house at the end of the road, and they and Irene and Edwin fell into the easy pattern of a close family, Sunday suppers rotating between houses, the children underfoot and beloved, the adults talking long into the evenings about the things that mattered to them. James Maddox started school at Irene's school in the fall of 1892, at 6 years old, which created certain interesting dynamics that Irene navigated with strict professional fairness, and which Edwin found quietly entertaining. James was a serious child with his father's considered quality and his mother's gray-green eyes, and he was, objectively, one of the quickest learners in the room, which Irene worked very hard not to be visibly pleased about during school hours. After school hours, she was not required to be as disciplined. Sarah, at 2, was a different proposition, entirely energetic and verbal in the way some children are verbal before they have any real filter on it, saying exactly what she observed in a clear, carrying voice that had caused Edwin on at least 2 occasions to bite the inside of his cheek very firmly in church. Life in Salder's Creek in the early 1890s had a different shape than it had in 1883. The territorial push toward statehood was real now, politics and infrastructure and ambition all moving in the same direction, and the town was no longer quite the rough scatter of timber and adobe it had been. There was a proper hotel now, and a telegraph office, and a doctor who had been there long enough to know most of the families by name, and a road crew working on the section that connected them to the county seat. The mill was still the economic anchor copper prices held, the expansion had held, and Edwin's management of the hauling operation had become, quietly and without any announcement about it, essential to how the whole enterprise ran. Curtis Pratt retired in 1893 and recommended Edwin as his replacement, not just for the hauling operation, but for the overall management of the mill yard. There were people who made noise about it, there were always people who made noise about things, but the work spoke clearly enough that the noise did not amount to much. Edwin told Irene about the appointment over supper the night it was confirmed. She looked at him. "You are not surprised," she said. "No," he admitted. "Pratt told me last month it was likely. And you did not tell me." "I did not want to say it until it was certain," he said. "I know how you feel about certainties." She did know how she felt about certainties. She had spent enough of her life in the uncertainty of survival to have a deep preference for confirmed facts over plausible hopes. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For knowing that about me," she said. He looked at her with the full attention that had never diminished, not in 10 years of knowing her and 7 years of marriage, and said, "I know a great deal about you." "I know you do," she said. "That is one of my favorite things." The evening settled around them. The children were in bed, the house was quiet, the lamp made its warm circle on the table, and Irene Quinn, who had come to Salder's Creek with $42 and a ledger and the careful, stubborn will to survive, sat across from the man she had loved for 10 years and thought, "I would not change a single thing. Not the hard parts, which had made everything else possible. Not the waiting, which had made the finding sweeter. Not even the fear, which had made the courage necessary." She thought about the fence post. She thought about the brown paper parcel, sitting there in the early light of a June morning in 1883, left by a man who had nothing extra to spare and gave it anyway. She thought about how love announces itself sometimes not in grand gestures but in small ones, in a parcel of bread and salt beef on a fence post, in a question asked without expectation of a particular answer, in a man who goes without, quietly and without complaint, so that someone else does not have to. Edwin looked at her across the table. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The fence post," she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I think about it too." "Do you?" She looked at him. "What do you think about it?" "I think about the morning I first saw you," he said, "standing in the yard. You had your hair pinned back and you were carrying those ledger books and you looked." He stopped. You looked like someone doing something very hard and refusing to let it show. And I thought." He stopped again. "What?" she said. "I thought that someone should make it a little easier," he said. "If they could." She felt the simplicity of it, the full width of it, and she did not try to put words around it because some things are better without them. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, and they sat in the lamplight of their house in their town with their children sleeping in the next room and their life around them, large and solid and certain. Outside, the stars were doing what they always did over New Mexico, the full, absolute scatter of them across the dark, more stars than any one life could count. The sage moved in the night wind. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote did its lonesome, operatic best, and was not answered and tried again. Inside it was warm and it was home and it was theirs. And on the fence post outside the gate of the mill yard, empty now for 10 years, the old post still stood weathered and worn and unremarkable, the kind of thing you would never notice unless you knew what it had once held, and what that small held thing had started. James Maddox, growing up the way children do, faster than the speed at which the heart can track it, would later ask his mother once, when he was old enough to understand why questions have weight, how she and his father had come to be in love. She thought about the answer for a moment, this woman who had spent her whole adult life finding the right words for things, and then she said, "He gave me his lunch every day for a month before I understood he was going without." James considered this with the careful face of his father's expression on his mother's bones. "That does not sound like enough reason to fall in love," he said. "No," Irene agreed. "It is not the reason. The lunch was just how I saw him clearly. The reason is everything else, who he is all the way through, but the lunch was how I started to look." James thought about this. "And then you looked," he said. "And then I looked," she said, "and I kept looking. And what I saw was," she stopped and smiled, and it was the smile that still, after all these years, transformed her face. "More than enough. More than I had the sense to hope for." James Maddox, who had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and the particular good fortune of children raised by people who love each other honestly, nodded once with the weight of something filed away for later. He would understand it better, eventually. He would understand that love, at its most real, is not a feeling that strikes you once and remains static. It is a practice, like teaching, like hauling, like the careful tending of horses, something you do every day, in the small choices and the large ones, in going without so another person does not have to, in asking the real question instead of the comfortable one, in showing up at the fence post before dawn with a brown paper parcel, and leaving it without expectation. He would understand that his parents had built something that most people spend their whole lives looking for, a love that was equal and honest and rooted, the kind that grows stronger under difficulty, the kind that makes people more themselves rather than less, the kind that the desert sun cannot burn off because it goes all the way down to bedrock. He would understand all of this, but not yet. He was 6 years old, and there were other things to attend to first. He ran back out into the October morning, into the yard where the light was coming over the ridge in long gold lines, and his sister was doing something impractical near the fence, and his father was at the gate, arriving home from the mill, swinging off the big bay horse, not Copperhead anymore. Copperhead had been gone for years, but a similar bay with a blaze, because Edwin Maddox had a type with the easy motion of a man for whom the movement was as natural as breathing. Edwin Maddox caught his son under the arms and swung him up in the way that James was probably getting slightly too old for, and that Edwin would not stop doing until James actually asked him to, which would not be for several more years. Irene came to the doorway and watched her husband hold their son in the October light, with Sarah having abandoned her impractical project near the fence to come running and attach herself to Edwin's leg, and she leaned against the doorframe of the house she loved in the town she had chosen, and she was, without any complication or asterisk, happy. Edwin looked up from the children and found her in the doorway, the way he always found her, as if some part of him always knew where she was in relation to himself. He looked at her across the yard with those amber-brown eyes that she had first seen clearly over a dusty mill yard, and he smiled. She smiled back. And the October morning went on around them. The sky doing its New Mexico blue above the ridge, the sage moving in the cool wind, the mill working its steady pulse in the distance, as it would tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that were still coming, adding their weight and their light to the life that had started, absurdly and perfectly, with a brown paper parcel on a fence post in the early summer of 1883.